everybody says they want to get an A, and I know a lot of us aren't standing at that A right now, so I hope you come out and I can help you reach your goal. And I really don't want you to slack on that. You already had a preconceived notion of getting that A, so really don't go back just because you're doing bad right now. We can fix that. It's still really early in the year, so let's not mess up the rest of the semester. Thanks, guys.
All right, sage advice. Let's see here. Let's close that down. On Blackboard, if you scroll down, there's a link called Video Database, where I'll occasionally put some videos up. This one is a cover of Lady Gaga's Bad Romance. Have you seen this? If you haven't seen this, it's worth your time to watch it. It gets right at, listen to the lyrics because it explains exactly what the women's suffrage movement is all about. It's a catchy song and it's extremely well produced. So, again, if any of you ever become music video producers, I got a whole long list of stuff like this I'd like for you to make for me. Okay? Optional, it's not required, but it certainly will inform you about what some of these issues are. Plus, it's just cool. Okay, yes, close all. Now, let's get back to where we left off with the progressive era. Let me ask you this. Oh. All right. Hamburgers by a wide margin. Very good. Would it have made a difference if I had said hamburgers from different places? Okay. Maybe we'll do that later. All right. We left off last time talking about who the progressives were, that they included nearly every segment of the society at some point. Everybody supports some reform. Nobody supports all of the reforms. And so it's this shifting alliance of political action groups that try to get together to solve certain problems. They share these common characteristics of ideals and attitudes, their methodology. Then we started talking about the evolution of progressivism, how long before anybody called this progressivism, some of these reforms are already underway in the cities. The public health movement is a perfect example, trying to clean up the streets with better sewer systems and better water systems, trying to limit the outbreak of epidemic diseases. We talked about better fire protection and better police protection, things like building codes to make housing safer. We've also got this going on in the rural areas, in the counties, with the Farmers Alliances and the Grange, and later the Populist Party. Then it moves up to the state level, and you start seeing these reforms being implemented at the state level. Again, your best example is Wisconsin. In fact, it becomes known as the Wisconsin idea. Implementing these reforms that regulate business, that regulate banking laws, that give women the right to vote, that try to outlaw child labor, a variety of different reforms, all intended to try to improve society, fix some particular problem that somebody's identified. And this again is it's justified by using the police powers of government. We talked about police powers, right? Okay. We don't mean cops with guns on the streets. It's the authority that governments have to make rules to protect the public safety. And so this is the legal basis for all of this. Then, 1901, let me erase this here, it becomes this national obsession. And I date this 1901 because of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901. McKinley, remember, won the 1896 election by a pretty wide margin, thus meaning the Gilded Age stalemate is broken. The Republicans are going to be the dominant party for the next 36 years. Now, McKinley isn't really a progressive, though. He doesn't openly advocate for these reforms, certainly not on a national level. He's more interested in foreign policy issues, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming class. But he doesn't really follow up much. We've got this going on at the state level, at the city level, the county level, and there's increasing demands. The populace popularized, pun intended, this idea that the national government should act, should take more action, should be more active in trying to solve these problems. McKinley didn't really support that much. He runs re-election in 1900, but then he becomes our third president to get assassinated. This is when Teddy Roosevelt takes over, and this is when I date the beginning of the progressive era at the national level. Because now we've got a committed reformer in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt's career had a long history already of being a reformer. He was the police commissioner in New York City, and he professionalized policing. Up to now, before this, if you wanted to be a cop in New York City, well, you got your job through patronage. You made contributions to one of the local politicians, and when they won, they appointed you a police officer. No skills necessary, no training necessary. Most of these cops were just as corrupt as the criminals that they were trying to catch. Teddy comes in and he professionalizes this, makes it a civil service exam. You've got to take an exam. You've got to have certain specialized training. So that makes policing much more efficient, more professional. He serves as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he modernizes a number of things that the Navy does, especially when it comes to buying equipment and supplies and things like that, kind of trying to end this corruption. So now in 1901, he suddenly becomes president, and all of us who have been working at the local level or the state level and have identified ourselves as progressives, now look at the White House, they say, hey, there's somebody who thinks and acts like we do as the leader of our country. And Teddy then is the first president to embrace and publicly support many of these reform agendas. That, plus the fact that he changes the nature of the presidency. He's considered our first modern president because he uses it as a leadership position. So that makes him very distinct from the 19th century presidents, even going back to Lincoln and Washington. And he sets the model for all 20th century presidents. That he's going to use the presidency as what he called a bully pulpit. And bully has nothing to do with picking on people like we understand it today. He meant a place that he could espouse ideas and he could garner support and build support for certain things. It was a leadership role. He was in the spotlight. And Teddy loved this. He was young, he was vigorous, and he was not at all afraid to get in front of the newspaper reporters and tell them exactly what he thought. So now it becomes this national obsession. Roosevelt comes into office supporting all kinds of these things that have already been done at the state level. Now, Roosevelt has this idea of what we today would call administrative government. He believes the best way to organize and order society is to create agencies, government departments that have specific functions and that supervise and regulate a particular business activity. Now, this has been done at the state level, especially up in Wisconsin. New York picks up on this. Kansas picks up on this. Texas does it a little bit. California does it. The idea here is an ongoing supervision by the federal government through these administrative agencies that will be staffed by impartial experts who will base their decisions and make these rules purely on the basis of fact, with no political considerations whatsoever. Now, that's rather optimistic. You got to understand the context now, though. We're in 1901. Most people are still vividly remembering the Depression of 1893, and they remember the bloody labor strikes that occurred, and they remember the radicalism of the populists, and they're afraid. And Teddy now is offering them a middle ground between laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. Now, a lot of businessmen are going to resist the government trying to regulate them, trying to tell them how to do business, what they can and cannot do. And Roosevelt says, you guys are fools, you're idiots. Because if you continue screwing the public is going to rise up and overthrow the system. So the best way, and he's got the populist as a good example here. He says the best way to protect private property is to have modest, moderate reforms that channel business activity towards broader social goals. In a nutshell, he says we want to make the society better by tying your personal interest into the greater good. So he's kind of echoing that social gospel idea as well. Now, Roosevelt is going to have a couple of major successes here pretty quick. He wins the election in 1904. 1906, he gets the Congress to pass two major pieces of legislation. 1906, he gets the Pure Food and Drug Act, and the Meat Inspection Act. And he justifies this, and Congress passes it, and the Supreme Court upholds these laws based on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, essentially saying that, yes, the federal government does have the authority to make rules like this. Now, the Pure Food and Drug Act is huge. One, it's one of the major, these are the two first attempts for the national government to regulate businesses. Now, you got to understand Teddy. Big business is not necessarily bad. Teddy says big businesses, if they produce a good product and sell it at a fair price to their customers, there's nothing wrong with big corporations, that they actually benefit society by increasing our standard of living. On the other hand, if big corporations are greedy and selfish and produce bad products that end up screwing their customers, that's wrong. And he'll go after you. He'll file lawsuits under the Sherman Antitrust Act. It gets him then the reputation of being the trust buster. A trust is the synonym for big business in this period. But the distinction between good trusts and bad trusts rests solely with Teddy. If your company is producing a good product at a fair price, no problem. But if you're trying to screw people for your own benefit, he'll go after you. His the best example is he goes after John Rockefeller and breaks up Standard Oil Company. Now, Teddy follows this up here with the Pure Food and Drug Act. This is huge because up to now, there's no regulation on the food supply. Sometimes not even at the state level. And the meat packing industry was really bad about this, as were, well, the pharmaceutical industry. One of the more popular products, you walk into a drugstore in 1906, and the shelves are full of what we call patent medicines. And just as the name implies, somebody came up with a formula for something that they claim will cure some illness. They apply for a patent and they get the exclusive use to use that product and that name for a certain period of time. First name? Colton comes up with this concoction that he gets a patent for and he starts selling it. Dr. Colton's Feel Good Elixir. And on the bottle, he promises to cure just about everything that could make you not feel good. It'll cure the common cold. It cures athlete's foot. It cures dandruff. It cures erectile dysfunction. I mean, every problem that you can think of, Dr. Colton's Feel Good Elixir will solve. The problem is, it's not a medicine at all. It's probably grain alcohol, 200 proof, 100% corn liquor that he's put a little bit of food coloring in and maybe some flavoring. What, cherry, maybe, grape? Yeah, something like that. And so people will buy this stuff. You can't go to sleep. Promises to cure insomnia. Well, you take a couple of swigs of this and yeah, you pass out. You go to sleep. Okay? Or better yet, Kira comes up with a product that she sells that cures everything that Dr. Colton's elixir cures, only she calls it Mama Kira's cure-all. Okay. All it is water with a couple of grams of opium in it. Today, we're not having our first opioid crisis. People like Kira started this in the 1890s, the early 20th century. It's water with a couple of grams of opium in it, and it promises to cure everything. So, Natalia, her baby's fussy. Her baby won't go to sleep. And that means, well, Natalia gets no sleep either. And she's been at work all day, and she's been taking care of the family when she got home, and now the baby's all fussy and won't go to sleep. So she reaches for the shelf to get some Mama Kira's cure-all and gives her baby a couple of drops of this stuff. Sure enough, the baby goes to sleep. And now Natalia says, man, I got to get some sleep too. So she takes a couple of drops of it. And she goes to sleep. What's happening here with these patent medicines is that we're creating an entire nation of alcoholics and drug addicts. Guess who the number one category, as a group, the number one drug addict group in America is in 1906? Okay, back here in the Hallelujah choir. Somebody back here. Tell me, who's the number one group of drug addicts and alcoholics in America at this point in time?
White people.
Not just white people. You can't have a number one group and it's everybody. Okay? I'll accept whites as a partial definition. Who else? More specifically. Not men. Is this just so far out of the box? Now you're just taking guesses. Otters. Cows. Green cows. White. Middle class. Women. Thank you. As a group, number one group of alcoholics and drug addicts in America in 1906 is white middle class women. Guess who the number two group is? No. They're children. We're creating a nation full of crack babies because of these impure, destructive, dangerous products that are on the market. The Food and Drug Act is passed, and it creates a regulatory agency at the national level known as the Food and Drug Administration. You've heard of them. Now, anytime somebody wants to bring a product to market that claims to cure an illness or some type of a food product, it has to be approved by the FDA. You submit all of your information and product samples to the FDA. Scientists in a laboratory who are professionals, experts in this field, will examine the product, research it, think about it, and then decide whether this is a good product or a bad product. And sorry, Dr. Colton and Mama Kira's elixirs don't pass the test. They're not real medicines. In fact, they're harmful. And so they're outlawed. This is done in the name of regulating for the public safety. The Meat Inspection Act is going to do the same thing, specifically in the meat packing industry, which at the time was rather disgusting. People were very worried, and most people would not eat meat that was produced outside their local area because they didn't quite know what was in it. And this meat packing industry's fault. These big slaughterhouses in Indianapolis, which was a pork slaughtering capital, or Chicago, which becomes one of the beef processing centers. These animals collected from all over the country would go through a moving disassembly line, and there's no telling what you finally get in your hamburger. Rats running across the rafters in the ceiling, fall off the rafters into the grinder, and nobody bothers to pull it out, and it just gets ground into your hamburger. Hair and all. Mike works at the meat processing factory, and these places are cold. And the floors are very slippery because of all the animal blood that's spilled on them. And Mike's job is to take this side of beef that comes down the line and shove it through a bandsaw, split it in two so it goes down two other lines so other people can cut it apart. Well, most of the time, and he's pushing these 300-pound sides of beef through this, so it takes some muscle and it takes some effort. Okay, and he's got to push it through here, and he's got to keep up with the pace, because if it starts building up, then the boss is going to fire him because he can't keep up with the pace. So he's struggling to keep up here, just pushing them through and pushing them through. And then one day he slips on that slick floor and he doesn't get his hand out of the way in time. Zip, cuts his hand off. Now, here goes a side of beef with Mike's hand on it. Nobody bothers to knock it off. It just gets flipped into the grinding barrel, and now your hamburger has Mike in it, along with Rat. And Mike, well, he can't do the job anymore, so he's fired. Meat Inspection Act, through the Department of Agriculture, will hire inspectors that will work government employees, not paid by the company, but paid by the government, will be placed in every meat processing facility. And they're responsible for making sure that good sanitation rules are followed, that impure products, impure things don't fall into the meat. One of the great things that they used to do is, well, a pile of scrap had been collecting here over the last couple of days, just laying out in the open, and it was, of course, starting to smell bad and kind of turning gray. Well, they'd take it and they'd put it in a big vat and add bleach and red food coloring. And the bleach would get rid of the nasty smell, and the red food coloring would make it look like it's fresh. They'd grind it up and sell that to you as hamburgers, and hope you didn't notice the maggots that were growing in it. The Meat Inspection Act makes all of these practices illegal, and it's done through a federal agency for the purpose of protecting the public safety. Again, justified through the Commerce Clause, because these products are sold across state lines. So this becomes kind of a widely accepted. These bills were passed by a broad coalition, a bipartisan coalition of both Republicans and Democrats. Now, 1908, Roosevelt decides not to run for another term. He handpicked his successor, his friend, William Howard Taft. Now, Taft, completely different personality. Roosevelt was young, vigorous, and he loved being in the spotlight. He loved being the leader. Taft, well, for one thing, he's obese. He's 350 pounds. Legend has it that he got stuck in the White House bathtub one time, and they had to break the bathtub to get him out. He posed for a picture sitting on top of a horse, and the entire country felt sorry for the horse. He was pale-skinned, weak-voiced. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. He was much kind of more like the Gilded Age presidents. He didn't want to be a leader. Now, he didn't undo anything Roosevelt had already started, but he didn't do anything more like Roosevelt was hoping he would. Instead, Taft focused on big business, with breaking up big businesses. Roosevelt has the reputation of being the trust buster, but it was actually Taft who broke up more large corporations, at least twice as many as Roosevelt did. Well, now we get to 1912, another presidential election. Taft is going to run for re-election. He controls the party machinery. Roosevelt comes back angry at his friend for not following through on his agenda. So Roosevelt challenges Taft. Now that's rare for somebody to challenge a sitting president from their own party. And so now you've got two factions in the Republican Party. The more progressive wing, led by Roosevelt, and the less progressive wing, led by Taft. Well, Taft gets the nomination because he's got the votes among the party activists. Roosevelt and his followers get up and walk out of the convention. And they form their own third party called the Bull Moose Party. It gets its nickname because Teddy's as strong as a bull moose. It is actually known as the Progressive Party. One of the few times that progressive, the name progressive, has actually been attached to a political party. So the Progressive Party of 1912 nominates Teddy Roosevelt, splits the Republican Party. Now, remember, I told you that most progressives endorsed capitalism. They didn't want to get rid of capitalism. Now, there's a small minority that comes out of this labor radicalism and the more radical populists that do form a socialist party. And they nominate Eugene Debs, a labor leader who happens to be serving a prison sentence. And in the election, Debs gets almost 1 million votes while he's in prison. This leaves it wide open for the Democrats. The Democrats think this is our chance. So they look around, they reject William Jennings Bryan, who'd been their candidate for the last several elections, and they turn to the progressive governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson, again, has a reputation of being a progressive, but not as progressive as Roosevelt. And this, in part, is from his background. He's a Southerner by birth. He's highly educated. He's got a PhD. He becomes our first PhD president, PhD in political science. He was governor of New Jersey, where he implemented some reforms. But then, when he runs for president, he rejects and won't support many of the popular reform agendas that are out there. Now, in this 1912 election, Roosevelt calls his agenda the New Nationalism, which is basically a summary of what he did and what he was thinking while he was president before. He said big businesses are not necessarily bad, but they need to be supervised. They need to be regulated. We're going to create these government agencies staffed by impartial experts that will make rules concerning these particular business behaviors. For instance, you can't put rats or Mike in your hamburger. And he supports things like women's suffrage. He supports the direct election of senators. He supports the initiative referendum, the recall, some things that have already been done at the state level. He supports workers' compensation. So just about everything that the progressives had been asked, that most progressives have been asking for, Teddy supports. He wants to see it become law. Wilson, on the other hand, starts off much less ambitious. He calls his agenda the New Freedom. He says the problem is big business. Big businesses are screwing the public, and they're destroying competition, which limits innovation and opportunity. So he says we need to get rid of big businesses. He picks up on that populist rhetoric then. He picks up on that anger that's still churning beneath the surface. And he says we're going to get rid of big businesses, reforms and regulations are fine at the state level, but the national government's role is going to be limited to breaking up the big corporations. He doesn't support women's suffrage. He doesn't support prohibition. He doesn't support ending child labor or workers' compensation insurance or many of the other basic progressive ideas. Now, what happens on election day, it's really not even close. Debs gets 1 million votes, which is funny. Taft gets very few votes. The real race is between Roosevelt and Wilson. And when it comes down to it and they count the votes, Wilson wins 82% of the electoral vote. So he clearly wins the election because the Electoral College is what counts. But he only got 42% of the popular vote. More people voted against Wilson than voted for him. Either way, he becomes president because he won the Electoral College. Now, the irony of Wilson is that he starts off much less ambitious. He ends up accomplishing more things and making more reforms than even Roosevelt thought was a good idea. And this is in part because of World War I. So now Wilson scraps the new freedom and embraces what he had previously called regulated monopoly. He embraces Roosevelt's new nationalism. And this now becomes the model. It becomes the norm for reform and federal government activity, creating these independent regulatory agencies staffed again by impartial experts that will supervise these activities on an ongoing basis. This sets up everything that happens throughout the 20th century then. This is still how we address these ideas and these issues. So Wilson becomes more interventionist, more regulatory than even Roosevelt thought was a good idea. Wilson's an interesting character. He's going to go through several changes during his presidency. Let me ask you this. Where did progressivism begin? Where did progressivism begin? Where do we find the beginnings of progressivism? All right. Results say E. All of these are correct except A, which is E is the correct answer. Very good. Now, one of the questions that we need to think about as we're analyzing this phenomenon of progressivism is this a movement for justice or is this a movement for social control? And this is relevant because today the term progressive means something slightly different than it did in its original form. And this idea of control of government power becomes a very political issue. And the two sometimes get tied together in ways that they shouldn't get tied together. So what was it about? Social justice or social control? Now, today we've got this social justice movement, and people who support it are referred to as social justice warriors, either positively or negatively. And people who oppose some of these things are simply saying that this is another way to increase the power of government, to limit our freedoms. Well, this was on the minds of people in the early 20th century as well. So which was it? Historians Arthur Link and Richard McCormick give us a good way to understand this that applies even today. What is the motive for these reformers? What are they seeking? You can apply that to any group out there today for the same analysis or analytical tool. What is it that they're seeking? Are they seeking greater freedom and justice and equality for everybody, or just themselves, or are they trying to limit and control somebody else? Well, Lincoln McCormick said that in this progressive era, you can break it down into about 3 basic categories. The first they called the social progressives. Think of these groups as the do-gooders. They seek social justice over social control. They want to create a more fair, more kind, more equitable society for everybody, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, religious affiliation, whatever. It's kind of put the social gospel in action. The settlement house movement is a good example here. And these folks will break with the earlier traditions that instead of blaming individuals for their problems, they seek a systemic solution. They want to figure out a way that doesn't moralize or chastise or lay guilt or shame on somebody for their position, but are actively and genuinely seeking ways to improve people's lives. And so you'll see this turn out in a number of ways. For instance, helping to organize folks in the poor neighborhood where the city never comes to collect garbage. Now, the rich people in their part of town get the garbage picked up every day. You, the poor folks in your part of town, the garbage might get picked up once a month. And it piles up in the streets, back alleys, and when it rains, it spreads all through the cities, and your children are out there playing in this filth. And that's clearly a threat to the public safety. So they'll demand that city government provide equitable services for everybody. These are the folks that are going to support women's suffrage. These are the folks that are going to try to outlaw child labor. The muckrakers fall into this category. There's another group that Lincoln McCormick identified that they call the coercive reformers. Now, these are folks that simply don't like something or somebody. Think of these folks as the control freaks, because their main concern is to control the behaviors or limit the behaviors or the freedoms of some other group that they think is a threat. They're not seeking social justice, they're seeking social control. One of your best examples here would be the prohibition movement. Now, even though the social progressives generally supported prohibition because of its negative effects, or alcohol's negative effects on the family and the society, the coercive reformers would have been like my great-grandmother. She would have felt right at home supporting prohibition because she didn't like alcohol and she didn't like people who drank. I've told you about great-grandma Roberta, right? Okay. And why she didn't like drinking? No. Liquor was the devil's urine. And if you drink it, you're literally, she believed, drinking the devil's urine. She'd say, that's why it burns when you swallow it. So she just didn't like people who drank. So she supported this for the purpose of, I don't like your behavior, and so I want laws passed that will limit your behavior. She didn't care about the fact that you had the freedom to do this if you choose. She wanted to take that freedom away from you. Another perfect example of the coercive reformers, Jim Crow. Down in the South, progressivism means progressivism for whites only. Again, that zero-sum game. If whites are going to get ahead, then we have to limit blacks. And so de jure segregation, Jim Crow, occurs right at the same time that the progressive era is going on. And so if you try to characterize the progressive era as being all about social justice and helping people, you're missing part of it. Because the people that supported prohibition and Jim Crow and immigration restrictions were all using that progressive mentality and that progressive methodology. Only now they didn't care about fairness or justice. They didn't like somebody or something, and they wanted to get rid of it. The anti-tobacco movement today might be a good example of this. Anti-drug things might be an example of this. We got to get rid of drugs because we don't like drugs. Okay? You can't smoke a joint because, well, somebody doesn't like it. So this is the dark side of progressivism, that people generally don't associate with the more positive aspects of it. But it's there. It's occurring. And then Lincoln McCormick give us a third category they call the reforming professionals. These are the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the dedicated public servants, the engineers. Businessmen fall into this category. Businessmen will come to support progressivism, even regulations, because they realize that it's good for business. If your meatpacking company has government inspectors there, and these government inspectors certify that your product is 100% wholesome and healthy, you can use that to advertise your product to get more sales. Imply that your competitor's food is not as healthy as yours is. You comply with these regulations. It's also a way to limit competition. The smaller meatpacking companies go out of business because they can't comply with all these new rules. So the big companies get rid of their competition and become even bigger. So businessmen support this. You'll see this in the public health movement. You'll see this in education professionals like John Dewey, standardized school curriculums so that children in Massachusetts are basically learning the same things as children in Oregon. And students in Florida are learning the same thing as students in California, so that we can create kind of this standardized common knowledge. And they're coming up with new ways of trying to educate children. They focus on adult education because a lot of these new immigrants that have come over, even poor whites in the South, let alone the poor blacks in the South, many are illiterate. And it just doesn't, an illiterate society just can't function efficiently. So these folks are concerned. They want social justice, but they're willing to use social control to achieve their goals. Social justice education reformers believe that everybody needs to know a little bit about American history. So they create the Department of Education, and they write rules for the curriculum that says all college students in the state of Texas must take at least 2 American history courses. Now, you don't like that, but it's for your own good. And so we're going to control you. I know most of you wouldn't be here. Well, 3 of you would be here if this wasn't required. But it's required, and we're going to control you. We're going to make you learn this stuff. We're going to make you learn basic algebra. We're going to make you learn something about biology. And so it's social justice using means of social control. And so ask yourself, when you hear somebody talking about they want immigration reform or monetary reform or some type of reform, which category do they fall in? And who's going to benefit and who's going to be harmed by their ideas? Let me offer you up here a couple of conclusions then to kind of draw all of this together. Why is this significant? Because it transforms the way we govern our society. Progressivism represents a transformation of governance at all levels. At the local level, at the county level, at the state level, and certainly, most certainly, at the national level. It redefines the Founding Fathers' notions of federalism and which level of government has the authority to make certain types of rules. And again, under the Commerce Clause, the federal government now assumes the police powers that it may or may not specifically have had. Because now, by the early 20th century, almost everything is involved in commerce and crosses state lines. And this gives the national government the authority to regulate these parts of society. So it's a new understanding in the role of government and what government should do. Roosevelt's new nationalism becomes this mainstream philosophy that both Republicans and Democrats embrace. What you're going to see then is an expansion, you're going to see an expansion of administrative government. All of these government agencies will be created at the local level, the county level, the state level. The Wisconsin idea is a perfect example. And at the national level. These agencies will be staffed by experts who will make impartial decisions on what's best for the public safety, for the public good. And that's rather optimistic that these people, the progressives, truly believe that these experts would make their decisions 100% based on fact, and that they couldn't be bribed, they couldn't be persuaded to, change their reports that would favor one group or the other. That they'd be 100%, they'd be like the baseball umpire. Calls them as they see them, doesn't care who wins or loses. He's there to make sure the game is played fairly. And that's the role the federal government's going to take here. And you see this, the most important level here then at the national level. You're also going to see the rise of special interest groups, or as we today would call them, lobbies. Groups of individuals have something that they want to accomplish or something that they want to prevent. And so they find other like-minded individuals and they form an organization. And then they study the idea, they come up with conclusions, ways that would solve their problem. They draft up laws and then hand them to government officials and say, please pass this into law. And there's millions of these special interest groups out there. Some are conservative, some are liberal, some of them are in between to some degree. And it's private individuals, again, pressuring government. For instance, the healthcare lobby, made up of doctors and hospital administrators and insurance company executives, will pressure congressmen to either support Obamacare or to oppose Obamacare. Businessmen will form an organization called, like the National Association of Manufacturers or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. and they'll pressure government officials to enact rules and laws that benefit them. The tragedy in Las Vegas. If you're concerned about gun rights, gun ownership, then you'll probably join the National Rifle Association. If, on the other hand, you think that this was caused by a proliferation, way too many guns out there, then you're going to join a group, an interest group like the Coalition to Ban Firearms, to try to get rid of these weapons. And so they're all over the place. And so it's in many ways not much different than progressivism, the shifting alliance of political groups trying to influence government. So the progressives then leave us with this legacy of mixed accomplishments. First, the populists were the first to confront these problems and try to do something about it. It's just that the populist ideas, well, really would have only benefited the farmers. And they were kind of the control freak type. They didn't care about anybody else. They wanted the government to act on their behalf. And some of their ideas were just too radical. But now the progressives come along and are really the first generation of Americans, many former populists become progressives, to confront head-on these problems facing the modern urban industrial order. Remember, 1900 America is a completely different place than 1800 America. And things that our founding fathers could not even imagine are now the reality. And so this requires a rethink of what we expect. And the progressives should be complimented, they should be understood as trying to solve some of these problems. Now, some of them they did pretty well with. They got the direct election of senators ratified. They got an income tax put in place. They got women the right to vote. Hadn't quite gotten child labor outlawed yet, but they're still working on it. And so they accomplished many things. On the other hand, there's some things that they didn't even try to address. The majority of progressives don't really concern themselves with racial equality. Now, there's going to be a couple of progressive era groups, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, the NAACP, that concerns itself primarily with racial equality issues. For the most part, the progressives don't deal with that much. In fact, Woodrow Wilson is probably one of the more racist presidents we've ever had. As soon as he moved into the White House, he fired all of the African-American employees. That's because of his Southern tradition. So that's one of their failures. And they didn't do anything about it. They just simply ignored it. So they leave us this legacy of mixed accomplishments. Now, many historians argue that it fades after World War I. That the progressive era ends in 1918, or at least 1920, when when Wilson leaves the presidency. Lincoln McCormick, who I will side with, say no, it really goes past World War I. That certainly many people became very disillusioned because of the war. This was the bloodiest, most horrible war ever. And many people who were progressives kind of came to this conclusion, oh my God, we suck. Humanity hasn't gotten any further along than we have before. And so they just kind of lose interest and become disappointed, disenchanted, lose their enthusiasm. On the other hand, this is the period between 1918 and 1924 when most of the more coercive reforms get passed, like prohibition and the National Origins Act that limited immigration. And so it extends past the presidents most identified, Roosevelt and Wilson. But certainly, it comes to an end. What did we learn from all of this, though? This is the beginning of big government. You hear people complaining about big government all the time. Well, this is the origin. And the origin of this is that government is going to serve as this counterweight to big business. And the two will balance each other out. As a result, the progressive era comes to an end, but not until it's accomplished some major changes in the American political system and what we expect our government to do. Now, it's not the last change that we're going to see, but it's one of the most major changes, certainly up to this point. So answer this for me. Which of these statements is not true? All right, results say, ooh. Ooh. No clear consensus here. Think about it again. Look through your notes. Talk to your friends. There is only one. Which statement is not true? Not true. Read the question, yes. Which statement is not true? We'll open it up again. A little bit different this time. Correct answer is B. All right, that's all I got for you. I'll see you back on Thursday. We'll start with chapter 21. You too.